Roughly 1,800 people packed the pews of Denver's oldest African-American church in February, worried about immigration crackdowns and eager to learn how they might resist. They gathered as word spread of a looming raid in the area by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
I was going to tell y'all to make some noise, but you already made some noise. Look around. This is amazing. The spirit of the people to fight back is strong.
Katie Leonard is with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which organized the gathering.
Because when immigrant rights are under attack, what do? What do? Beautiful.
Leonard then listed off some of the ways the Trump administration has cracked down on immigration, including executive orders to end birthright citizenship and suspend asylum claims, and his threats to prosecute state and local officials who don't comply with federal immigration policies.
But people weren't just there to air their grievances. They wanted to learn about their rights.
Pub quiz. Do you have to identify yourself to ICE? That's right. You can use your right to remain silent.
That included rights given to them by the U.S. Constitution.
Cool. Can everybody read the words on that slide right there? Yeah. Let's read them aloud together. Do you have a warrant? If not, I do not consent to a search.
They also discussed protections already on the books in Colorado, measures that prohibit local law enforcement from working closely with ICE, and that don't allow police or any other public officials to ask you to, quote, show your papers.
Who's ready? Let's make a plan. Thank you.
Just days after this meeting, ICE did conduct raids at a handful of locations across the Denver metro area. And in the months since, President Trump has taken unprecedented steps to carry out his campaign promise of mass deportations.
Republicans in Congress have supported the president's efforts, going after state and city leaders they say are standing in the way.
The American people are fed up with the policies that protect criminals, waste taxpayer dollars, and prioritize illegal immigrants over the safety and well-being of hardworking citizens.
In response, Democratic lawmakers in Colorado have introduced a bill that aims to stymie some of the tactics they've seen deployed by ICE and the White House. It's a game of immigration cat and mouse that could have big consequences for Colorado's immigrants, their communities, and the state itself. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance, a show about Colorado politics, policy, and the 2025 state legislature. I'm Benta Birkeland.
And I'm Lucas Brady Woods with KUNC. Tensions around immigration have been steadily growing for years now, but this political moment we're in, I think it's fair to say, was ignited in many ways by the vast surge in people crossing the border under the Biden administration. Denver in particular has seen a record number of migrants over the last few years, some of the most per capita in the country.
One reason they came here is because Texas was sending them, and this was part of an effort to punish states that make life easier for undocumented people. And Colorado is definitely one of those states trying to do that. Colorado has laws meant to hinder deportation operations and a network of nonprofits and local resources to support immigrants.
At the same time, anti-immigrant sentiment has been rising both across the country and here in Colorado. Lots of people feel like the system is broken and the border has become meaningless.
Claims that a Venezuelan gang was terrorizing Aurora even brought then-candidate Donald Trump here last fall.
But Kamala has imported an army of illegal alien gang members and migrant criminals from the dungeons of the third world. They come from the dungeons, think of that, the dungeons of the third world, from prisons and jails, insane asylums, and mental institutions. And she has had them resettled beautifully into your community to prey upon innocent American citizens. That's what they're doing.
Even before Trump won the election, the legislature's most active lawmakers on immigrant issues were working on expanding the state's protections. They wanted to find ways to fortify Colorado's policies against the crackdown they feared was coming.
They spent 5 months working behind the scenes before finally unveiling their proposal at the Capitol earlier this year.
This bill creates clarity amidst the chaos, confusion, and uncertainty that our communities are facing today. By putting forward this legislation, Colorado stands proudly alongside states throughout the country who are taking steps to solidify immigrants' civil rights in a number of issues.
This piece of legislation is something of a culmination, an expansion and honing of numerous laws that have been passed in recent years to protect immigrants within Colorado.
It's also a provocation to the Trump administration at a time when the stakes for this issue have possibly never felt higher. First, let's go into some of the details on the bill Democrats are proposing this session. What does it actually do?
One thing to know is that even though lawmakers started before Trump was sworn in, a lot of this bill was written more recently, in sort of real time as lawmakers watched the news and heard from people in their communities. Here's bill sponsor Julie Gonzalez.
We also really drafted a lot of this policy in response to the actual tactics that we have seen be utilized by, ICE now under the second Trump administration.
Colorado already has a lot of laws in place to try to protect immigrants, enough laws that many Republicans consider this a sanctuary state. What more did Democrats think they wanted to do or could be done in this area?
So they really went back to what's already on the books and looked at ways to expand those policies and fill in any gaps. One of the biggest things Colorado has done is a 2019 law that was the first to sort of put limits on the ways that local law enforcement can cooperate with ICE and other federal immigration authorities.
That law says local police can't pick up anyone or hold anyone in jail just because ICE asks them to.
Exactly. And then there was another law a couple of years later that says no one working for the state can look into someone's immigration status or give their personal information to ICE without a warrant.
These sound fairly expansive. How much more can Democrats do here?
Well, they found some of those gaps that they went looking for, and they want to fill them as they try to prevent Colorado from helping the federal government find and detain people. The biggest thing this new bill does is add a lot more levels of government and public organizations to the state's ban on sharing personal information with ICE. So already state employees can't give people personal information to ICE without a warrant, but this bill adds cities and counties, plus school systems, public daycares, public health clinics, and others from sharing records. So, for instance, schools are already blocked from sharing student records with ICE, but it looks like this law tries to go even further to restrict communication.
It's interesting the ways in which this bill is trying to expand on what's already on the books. How much of an impact do you think this will have on the ground if it does pass?
Well, one concrete thing it would do is around how jails interact with ICE, specifically preventing officers from letting ICE into non-public areas to pick people up.
Clearly, a lot of concern from people on the left and Democrats about the tactics federal officials might use to find people who aren't documented. Are there other ways the bill tries to keep people from coming to the notice of authorities?
Yeah, it would make it easier for people convicted of low-level crimes, known as petty crimes, to petition a judge to vacate their plea.
So this is in the context of what's happening nationally, that people with these low-level crimes could still be put as kind of a target for ICE for deportation.
Yeah, the Trump administration is taking a zero-tolerance approach to criminal records. Lawmakers say immigrants may be at risk from having even the smallest things on their records, things that some policymakers don't believe should put people in danger of being deported at all.
Lucas, you listened to the bill hearing for this. This measure is moving through the legislature as we speak. Did anyone testifying give examples, concrete examples of situations like this bill imagines? So people worried about a petty criminal history, or are we aware of local officials like cities and counties helping ICE?
There were dozens of people that testified, both about their fears of these things happening and about things that have actually happened to them already. One woman told the story of her husband's marijuana conviction from many years ago that's prevented him from becoming a legal permanent resident. And not having a green card can make him really vulnerable, at least as far as Democrats are concerned.
The two of us and the rest of the press corps has spent a lot of this session waiting for this bill. I remember talking to various reporters, like, have you seen it? Do we know when it's going to be introduced? And asking lawmakers. And we both heard right at the start of session on the first opening day that lawmakers were working on this. Given that this is such a top priority, why do you think this bill took a little bit longer to eventually be introduced?
Well, first of all, for any policy this complex and this much in the news, it's not unusual for it to take a while to get to the point where lawmakers are ready to introduce it. Also, in this case, I know the sponsors were talking with the governor's office and kind of going back and forth about whether he would have any major concerns with it so that they wouldn't be facing an immediate veto threat from him.
Another big question for this type of policy is potential federal pushback. When I talked to backers of this bill, even before it was introduced at the beginning of session, they didn't seem too worried about that possibility. At least they weren't going to let it deter them from what they wanted to do. The Democrats I spoke with just said it's too important for Colorado to take action right now on this immigration issue, regardless of what the federal government may do.
Still, when the bill finally hit the Senate floor, that was one of a lot of concerns you heard from Republican lawmakers. They warned that not only is it a mistake for Colorado not to be making it easier for ICE to arrest people here, but they also said the bill could make it harder for local law enforcement to keep Coloradans safe. Public safety concerns. And they also said it would create unequal protections for a single group of people. Here's Senate Minority Leader Paul Lundeen.
This is probably the biggest and the most challenging argument I will make against the bill, but I think it weakens accountability for immigration status. And again, that's where we're intruding into this domain that is not ours. Immigration policy, at the end of the day, is not the primary province of the state, but it is, in fact, a federal policy. And we are taking steps here that will weaken federal definitions, federal understandings of immigration status and the appropriate interactions with regard to individuals who have the various statuses.
Lundeen also argued it would put undue strain on the state's resources.
It is inevitable, a bill of this nature, in the charged political state-federal environment that we have right now, it is inevitable that this bill will invite lawsuits.
Budget considerations for things certainly always do come up, especially we know that next year is going to be an even tighter budget year. Now let's talk about some of the implications for these policies and what's happening on the ground outside of the Capitol building. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capitol News Alliance.
As lawmakers debate this bill at the state capitol, ICE has been busy across the Denver area and elsewhere, carrying out raids and detaining people under Trump's aggressive immigration policies.
Any new legislation state lawmakers pass this session will have to contend with the reality of what's already happening on the ground, which is why we decided to bring in who I consider an expert in this area, CPR's Allison Sherry. She is our justice reporter, and she's been covering this issue very closely. Allison, thanks so much for joining us on Purplish.
Very happy to be here.
Allison, based on some of your reporting, how does this present moment in federal immigration enforcement feel different from how ICE has operated in the state in the past?
I think that there's a sense that there was no immigration enforcement happening under President Biden or under President Obama. But that's not true. ICE has always worked with sheriffs, and ICE has always gone to jails and prisons and picked people up when they've been released. That is not a new thing. That's been happening for decades. It's happening now. The differences are that they are now taking people with some sort of status, people who may have an asylum claim and are on legal asylum parole, have work authorization. They have pulled student visas, people who are just going to school and didn't commit any crimes. None of that has really happened before.
That's really interesting. I mean, do you have any sense, though, where ICE has been concentrating their arrests right now? Is it certain parts of the state, more urban areas, or something?
I think it's everywhere. We've heard of ICE enforcement in Garfield County, in Mesa County, in southern Colorado, in Denver, in Adams County. They have done large-scale raids, flash grenades, and they bring in like Hummers into parking lots of apartment buildings at 6 a.m. They've kind of scaled a little bit back on those, but they're picking up people on lunch hours. They're picking up people in parking lots as they're driving to work. And we know that they're picking up people going to court.
Allison, the stories you've been doing lately, I think they just really show how wide a net ICE is casting under Trump. And one that really struck me is a story you've been working on. You've been following an asylum seeker from Mauritania. He was picked up and detained. Tell me more about him and how did he get caught up in all of this?
In short, he got caught up in all of this because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was leaving his apartment on February 5th, which was the day of that very big raid I mentioned earlier. So he gets detained, even though he has all of these IDs and he has, his work authorization and everything. He actually, at the time, he has no criminal record. He wasn't worried. He thought, oh, this is just a misunderstanding. They'll look me up and they'll see that I've filled out an asylum claim and I have no criminal record. And he was detained for 7 weeks. I mean, he comes from it's a very sad story. He was enslaved. Mauritania is in West Africa, and it's one of the last places in the entire world that still has some legal slavery. It doesn't technically on the books have legal slavery, but it still happens in practice. And he escaped this very terrible situation. He got to South America, came up through the Darien Gap, and then crossed into the United States in November 2023. He walked across the border and then turned himself in right away and claimed asylum. He had some family here already, so he came to Denver and just started working. He also got involved in the community. He volunteers at the East Colfax Collective, which does some affordable housing work. One of his hearings I went to at the detention center, there was a whole row of people there to support him, which matters to immigration judges, by the way. They like to see that.
I imagine for him and those close to him, they were pretty shocked that any of this happened to him. He's kind of nearing the end of his journey to immigrate here. It was really powerful to hear their perspectives.
When you come to a country like U.S., hoping that you may be safe over here, this is not the kind of situation that you were expecting. And if it happens to you, it makes you feel like not hopeful anymore. And I think U.S. should be showing a better image than this.
We mentioned that this bill would prevent jails from letting ICE go into non-public areas to collect people. How big of a deal is this?
I think it's kind of a point of non-clarity that exists in state law now. So I'm not surprised that lawmakers kind of want to address this. Denver has a law that they can't come into the public facility to get people. They can't do what they would call a transfer of custody from the Denver Sheriff's Office to ICE.
So within the jail, ICE can't go in there.
Right. I covered a story about a month ago of a guy who was released from the Denver jail. ICE was interested in him. This guy ran for it. And I've heard that this has happened before where people just run for it. In this case, the guy bit an ICE officer and put up a little bit of a fight. He was detained, now faces federal criminal charges for assaulting an ICE officer. In reporting that story, I called about 5 or 6 other jails to see, how do you release people? And it felt like every jail has a different policy and a different thing. Arapahoe County, they let them go a little bit like Denver, they have to kind of go out onto the sidewalk and ICE will get them there. In El Paso County, they invite them in. So they just come in and it's a real transfer of custody, not dramatic.
A lot different than maybe a foot chase in a parking lot.
Right. And I think in Denver, there actually is a foot chase sometimes. So I thought it was fascinating that there were so many different policies in place there and how different sheriffs handle it. So what you're seeing here is Colorado trying to set a uniform standard.
So one thing Democrats are focused on with this policy is looking at communication. So restricting what school employees can tell ICE, public health facilities, cities, counties. How much have you heard that local governments like cities and counties are working with ICE to help locate undocumented immigrants?
To be honest, I don't know how much local governments really know the status of people that they're interacting with. It's not like it's a typical question when you enroll your kid in school or you may be getting some public assistance. I don't think it's always like, we need to know your status. Even law enforcement officers don't ask status when they get a 911 call or they arrest somebody.
There was a Republican bill earlier this session that would have rolled back these existing communication restrictions with ICE, and several sheriff's departments came to the Capitol. They advocated for the bill, and they said they wanted it to be easier to work with ICE. How much have you heard from people in law enforcement frustrated by the restrictions Colorado already has in place, let alone this new proposal?
I don't hear local law enforcement complaining that they can't do enough for immigration all the time. I think if I really searched for someone, maybe I could find someone who's critical. But generally speaking, I think law enforcement wants people to trust them or else they can't solve crimes. And so people who are picked up by ICE in random raids all the time are going to start to increasingly not trust law enforcement. They're not going to want to report crimes. They're not going to want to come to courthouses and be witnesses. And that makes law enforcement squeamish overall. I don't think law enforcement deep down wants to be immigration enforcers too. Now, I have heard sheriffs say they wish they could hold people for ICE. There was a big case in the first Trump term where the Teller County sheriff, who's coincidentally now running for governor, was holding people at ICE's request for longer than their sentences. So someone would post a bond or they would serve their sentence for a crime. And then ICE would say, hey, can you just hold him? We can't get down there for a couple days. And he'd say, sure, I'll hold him. And they were sued for that. And judges upheld that you can't hold people for longer than their sentences at ICE's request.
I'm also curious, though, sort of on a more overarching level, are any law enforcement or prosecutors who you've talked to, do they find the Trump administration's more aggressive immigration policies not helpful and think it makes their jobs harder?
Well, yeah. Me and Ben Marcus, our colleague, did a story last week that talked about a number of criminal cases that are going through the courts where people have been deported or been detained by ICE in the middle of those criminal proceedings, which means they don't come to court because they're sitting in the detention center in Aurora, or they've been deported already. So we have documented that ICE is now interfering with the U.S. criminal justice system. This is Adams County District Attorney Brian Mason, who's had this happen in one of his cases.
When someone is deported before a local prosecutor like me has been able to charge and prosecute a defendant, one, it means that any victim in the case does not see justice. Two, it completely undermines our ability to prosecute what may be a larger case.
So interesting to get some of this detailed sense of what's happening on the ground right now. But circling back to the bill itself, Lucas, in talking with sponsors, how much of an effect do they think these changes will have?
They're certainly hopeful that they'll have some positive impacts for immigrants here in Colorado, but they also told me that they can't be sure if ICE is actually going to comply with this bill if it becomes law. And I think at the end of the day, they really want to make sure that with this bill, they're helping people understand their rights and what happens when they interact with ICE.
And I just want to say that we know that this administration has been kind of retaliatory, at least so far. At least in the immigration front, there's been a lot of talk about Colorado being a quote-unquote sanctuary state. That doesn't have a lot of definition really at all. But every time that state lawmakers are going to be putting up barriers to ICE doing things, Tom Homan, who's the border czar, has said that just means we're going to be in the communities even more. They can't get into courthouses now. Okay, fine, we're going to go to the grocery store. And they'll be, making more quote-unquote collateral arrests, which just means that they might be going and picking up a guy they want, but they might get his mother too, and they might get his neighbor too, and those are collateral arrests. So they've kind of put this threat over the state and other states that are quote-unquote sanctuary, that they'll just double down on their enforcement.
Around this topic of immigration, there's certainly been a lot of political theater drama around the issue. We saw that when Republicans in Congress brought in several big city Democratic mayors, including Denver Mayor Mike Johnston. He was there for a hearing, and Republicans didn't mince words about what they thought of these policies. Here's Representative Anna Paulina Luna, and she's from Florida.
I do not think you guys are bad people, but I think that you are ideologically misled, which is why, unfortunately, based on your responses, I'm all going to be criminally referring you to the Department of Justice for investigation.
Allison, I'm curious how much of this you think is political talking points, or do some of the GOP accusations line up with things we're seeing in Colorado?
I haven't seen any evidence, and I've talked to the Attorney General about this. There seems to be no evidence that any elected official in Colorado, any law enforcement officer in Colorado is breaking the law, like standing in ICE's way to do their job. If they were, I think they'd be prosecuted. It's pretty cut and dry. The state can't undermine or conflict with federal immigration enforcement. They're also not going to be a part of it. So they can't make a civil immigration arrest, for example. Only ICE can do that. There are some rules, but I have not seen any evidence that anyone is standing in ICE's way to go pick up people and deport them.
A lot of this also has to be put in the larger political context on the optics of things. And I circle back to voters I talked to about this issue before the election. I heard from a lot of people that they were really upset about how many immigrants are coming into the country in the last few years. And interestingly, it wasn't just Republicans. I was in Colorado's 8th congressional district, and that's our most diverse district. It's our toss-up district. A lot of people, even those who were going to vote Democratic, voters of color, were very concerned about immigration and public safety.
What's also interesting now, though, is the question of how those folks you just mentioned feel about the Trump crackdown. Like, is this what they actually wanted? Are they happy with what they're seeing? And if they are, that definitely suggests that Democrats who are pushing this bill could be out of step.
Sounds like I need to go back and talk to some more voters, which I plan to very soon. But we do have some polling information on what people think about the crackdown. I covered a bipartisan poll, and this was of Colorado voters. It came out recently. They surveyed people from across the political spectrum, so it mirrors the party affiliation in our state. A little over half said they think the administration's deportation policies have gone too far. But at the same time, that leaves about 30% who think Trump's taking the right approach, and nearly 20% of Colorado voters say he's not going far enough.
Very interesting breakdown. Any sense of how that compares to earlier surveys?
The pollsters said fewer voters now say immigration hurts Colorado more than it helps. People aren't as opposed to immigration, but there's also a significant increase in the number of voters who say they're unsure if immigration helps or hurts the state. And I'll note that those answers about the benefits and harms, they don't really change based on a voter's race or ethnicity. And for this poll, about 20% of the voters were people of color.
It just goes to show, really, with this polling and where voters stand, that these complex issues really have some unexpected and varied opinions in the public that might not line up with party.
I was just going to say, a lot of the immigrants I've interviewed over the past few months came across the border was in November 2023. The 40,000 people who came to Denver was in 2022 and 2023. There was a border crisis happening. And I think we all know now, looking at the politics of who's in charge, that the Democrats were not seen as being in control of that or taking the concerns that everybody had about all of these people. It was a massive swell of people, and I don't think that anyone should discount how that changed the face of all of our communities. And I don't think Democrats in particular were taking seriously enough how people were worried about all of that. And I think we're seeing the effects of that politically now. And now there's been kind of a clapback with immigration enforcement with this president in particular. And we'll see, what happens from here in 2 years and in 4 years.
That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
The CCNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets throughout the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Lucas Brady Woods.
And I'm Allison Sherry.
And I'm Benta Birkeland. Our producer is Stephanie Wolf, and our editor is Megan Verlee. Sound design and engineering by Shane Rumsey. Additional reporting in this episode from Kevin Beatty. Our theme music is by Brad Turner.
Purplish will be back in your feeds next week. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.